Hi, this is Orion, and you're listening to Orion's Bedtime Stories podcast. While I have a number of short stories and fairy tales here, for the next little while I'll be sharing a large chapter book with you, Illusion by Paula Volsky. For 200 years, the exalted classes have ruled over Vonar by virtue of their dazzling magical abilities. Now, their powers grown slack from disuse, they concentrate on the pleasures their station affords them, ignoring the misery of the lower classes. It is only when the red tide of revolution sweeps aside all distinctions of rank, home, and family that the exalted realize the gravity of their mistake. Thrust into the very center of the conflict is the beautiful Elise Vaux de Rival, spirited daughter of a provincial landowner. Now, like those she disdained, she must scramble for bread in the teeming streets of the capital city, the key to her abilities an elusive secret, and find a way to survive in a world gone mad with liberty. Orion's Bedtime Stories is proudly brought to you by Anchor FM. And if you've not heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Firstly, it is free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Then they distribute your podcast for you so you can be heard on Spotify, Apple, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership required. So you have everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Illusion by Paula Volsky. Chapter 8. The meeting had been publicized by word of mouth alone, yet it was well attended. The old vacant warehouse at number 17 Pump Street in the 8th District was crowded with members and would-be members of the People's Reparation Party, as the disciples of Whiss had taken to calling themselves. Lured by the prospect of viewing their elusive champion in the flesh, the faithful, together with the merely inquisitive, had turned out in force. The crowd was heterogeneous. Its components varied in age, occupation, and station, ranging in kind from large-handed laborer to lank-haired market woman, to shopkeeper, student, idler, random malcontent. Dotted here and there throughout the room, a few liveried retainers fidgeted in fear of recognition. Far more prevalent were the beggars, whose orchestrated pleas suggested intelligent organization. The plaints, entreaties, and veiled accusations issuing from dozens of throats exerted their inevitable effect, arousing guilt as well as resentment, pity as well as contempt, the whole resulting in reluctant charity exploited to the ultimate degree. A grudging rain of small coins pattered into a host of outstretched, unwashed palms. Consciences assuaged, the spectators were free to turn their righteous wrath upon the true source of their woes, the privileged class. The obligation of this class to redress all social and economic wrongs was not questioned for a moment by the zealots of the People's Reparation Party. Such obligation, after all, lay at the heart of the faction's very title. The level of excitement among the spectators was high. All of them, without exception, were familiar with the style and content of Veilleur's rancid neighbor Jumalle's complaint. All admired and revered the splenetic daring of Neighbor J, as they affectionately dubbed the editor, but few had actually encountered him. Whiss Veilleur, so outrageously outspoken in print, had hitherto proved retiring in person. His public appearances were infrequent, relatively unheralded, and with good reason. Unabashedly seditious in his sentiments, radical and subversive in his ambitions, Whiss Veilleur was doubtless destined for the gibbet, should he fall into the hands of the gendarmerie. A rendezvous with Master Shereen, as the city executioner was known, would shortly follow his capture, and this prospect had until now fostered a certain public discretion. Those so fortunate as to hear him in the taverns and backrooms that were his haunts described Velure as dynamic, a spellbinder, magically persuasive, an inspired and inspiring orator. But such witnesses were rare. Now, for the first time, Neighbor Jay had consented to address a sizable gathering of his followers, a decision presumably reflecting the burgeoning power of the People's Reparation Party and the mounting confidence of its leader. It was a considerable occasion, perhaps a historic event. All present sensed as much. Restless, impatient, hungry for direction, and disposed to unbridled enthusiasm, the reparationists awaited the revelations of the master. Restlessness was not confined to the audience. In a tiny corner office, originally intended for the use of a clerk-accountant and walled off from the rest of the warehouse by a couple of flimsy partitions, waited 3 men. One of them, seated at the desk, was elderly, gray-haired, drably clad, drooping and physically frail, irresolute, and indefinably unworldly of aspect. A second, decades younger, massive, ungainly, uncouth, with a flat, broad, impassive face, occupied a second chair. His hands were extraordinarily large, almost freakishly so, heavily boned, fat with muscle, and never still. He held a collection of interlocking wheels, cogs, gears, and springs, and with these mechanical parts he toyed continually. The third man, nearly 40 years old and hovering on the brink of middle age, was somewhat below middle height, slight and meager in build, plainly but scrupulously dressed. His thinning black hair was drawn severely off a tall brow. His narrow, sharp-jawed, thin-lipped, and sallow face was marked with the traces of boyhood smallpox and dominated by a pair of prominent, hugely translucent green eyes, so pale as to appear quite colorless in low light. Evidently possessed of excess nervous energy finding outlet in constant activity, he paced tirelessly about the office, pausing every 2 or 3 minutes to consult his pocket watch. Although the differences among the 3 men were very great, they did not preclude a certain subtle similarity. Perhaps it lay in the shape of the eyelids, the curve and depth of the skull, the bony angularity of the wrists, or most probably in the combination of the countless, nearly invisible shared characteristics that marked them as members of one family. The green-eyed man paused to check his watch for the 100th time. The babble of conversation on the other side of the partition intensified, and then a call, half pleading, half imperative, rang out, "Whiss!" The audience took it up, an emphatic, monotonous chant like the hiss of monster bellows. Whiss Velure started at the sound, and his hands jerked. He wheeled sharply to the face of the old man seated at the desk. "Come, father, no more delay," he urged. His voice was rather high-pitched, penetrating, and effortlessly compelling. "I am uncertain." The old man shook his head. "I do not know that it is necessary, or wise, or right." "We have been through all that, you know, more than once, and there's no time left to argue. The thing is settled. You know this. Moreover, you wouldn't have troubled yourself to travel all the way from Nice had you not intended to lend your assistance." "But do you truly require my assistance? It is never wise to employ arcane power unnecessarily, and I question the present need." "Whiss, you are eloquent beyond all measure, and so you have always been, without benefit of magical illusion. Therein lies your greatest strength and talent. What need to enlarge upon the gifts of nature?" "Ah, nature!"
Whiss's lips twisted. Easy enough for her cherished sons to laud her bounty, yet her generosity is scarcely consistent, and we are not all of us similarly blessed. A note of subtle accusation sharpened his voice. The older man heard it and sighed. Another might have supposed that Whiss spoke of the inequities existing between exalted and peasant, but his father knew better. Whiss, born entirely devoid of magical ability into a bourgeois family whose members were frequently gifted, had sensed himself underprivileged, outcast, and despised from the very start. His physical shortcomings, the short, skinny frame that precluded athletic prowess, all but requisite to youthful popularity, the pock-marked visage and decay-prone yellowish teeth that further set him apart, the squeaky voice suggesting effeminacy, all these had aggravated a galling sense of insignificance. His own very real advantages of energy, persistence, iron determination, and persuasive eloquence had always counted as inadequate compensation. Investigation into the source of the plebeian Valeur family's unlikely recurrent magical aptitude resulted in the predictable verification of an exalted ancestor's indiscretion. Such mésalliances were illicit, illegal, and of course inevitable, but the young Whiss had not accepted the discovery in a spirit of philosophical resignation. Viewing his ancestors' peccadillos as an outrage, his closest relatives' abilities as a personal affront, and his own varied deprivations as a clear manifestation of cosmic injustice, he had sought success, admiration, and self-validation in academic achievement. His intellect was sound, but not remarkable. His willpower and persistence, however, went far beyond the ordinary. By dint of wide reading, much memorization, and indefatigable application, he succeeded in amassing a store of knowledge that many, including Whiss himself, mistook for brilliance. The cultivation of his mind inspired him to the cultivation of his talents, most notably his persuasive powers, and there he displayed extraordinary ability. Hardly out of school, he was already producing countless essays, tracts, and pamphlets, discovering therein a flair for creative vituperation that won praise, censure, and above all, recognition. In secret, he practiced and perfected the arts of oratory, through infinite labor transforming his liability of a voice into an instrument of power, range, and expressiveness. His manner in debate became assured, challenging, intimidating. Frequently, he enlivened his addresses with shouting outbursts of seemingly spontaneous rage, stimulating to his audiences and terrifying to his opponents. And he began to be noticed, his name known in Neus, sleepy capital of Verve province, his pamphlets quoted, his aggressive, bullying style imitated. His success among the political clubs and debating societies of Neus fostered the young man's erroneous vision of himself as an original social philosopher. In truth, his concepts encompassed little beyond intense hatred of absolute monarchy, a longing for revolution, and the subsequent establishment of a just, profoundly moral society. Nothing new, yet the manner in which young Valeur, as Chol Valeur's son now styled himself, propounded his views was electrifying, and provincial listeners not overly discriminating. Whiss Valeur had succeeded in arousing considerable local turmoil, and felt himself a personage of some distinction by the time his activities caught the professional attention of His Majesty's Lieutenant of Varve. And all the cherished magical power of Chorl Valeur might not have sufficed to save his son's neck, had Whiss not wisely chosen that moment to depart Neus. He had fled under cover of darkness, drifted about the provinces for a year or so, eventually making his way to Shereen, where he was all but swallowed alive. The provincial firebrand found it no easy matter to make his mark in the capital. The eloquence deemed astonishing in Neus went almost unnoticed in Shereen. For years, Whiss eked out a pinched, precarious living, sometimes hack writer for beggarly hire, sometimes journalist, editor, printer's assistant, tutor, or scrivener, forever struggling, forever obscure. They knew him well, however, at the political clubs. He had hung around the Green Star League for months until the extremism of his views was criticized and he had quit in disgust, but not before loudly condemning the entire membership as dolts and weaklings. He had fared better for a while at the Barasier Club until the year he stood as candidate for secretary-treasurer. Losing the election, he had furiously denounced the balloting committee as corrupt and withdrew forever. Similarly spectacular incidents, and spectacular they truly were, for Whiss, in a rage, was like a demon beside himself, had marked his departure from several of the smaller clubs, but he had not faded altogether from view. He was still to be glimpsed in the most politically oriented of the cheap taverns, nursing a frugal glass of wine for hours on end, debating and haranguing far into the night. He often turned up at the gatherings and rallies, always attired in the same threadbare but meticulously clean black suit. And alone, always alone, for the rhetoric that often won admirers and followers never bought personal friends, and he had never been glimpsed by human eyes in the company of a woman. Sometimes he could be found on the street corners, handing out copies of his latest tract to all who would accept them, an eccentric, vaguely risible figure, hungry for something or other, one of the familiar cranks of Rat Town. And so matters might have continued indefinitely, had not a bewildering variety of social, political, and economic circumstances begun at that time to exert their influence in strange concert, the effect of one somehow disproportionately reinforcing the effect of another and another, to set up chaotic vibrations rocking the old Vonerish class structure to its foundations. These circumstances, ranging from the near total depletion of the state treasury by the wars of the last king's reign, and consequent crushing increases in taxation, to restrictive trade regulations designed to protect the profits of the exalted at the expense of the petite bourgeoisie, to 3 years' drought resulting in widespread crop failure and hunger, to the invention of the astonishing Griff's loom, the near simultaneous invention of the Coase furnace, and the resulting construction of new mills and factories about the largest towns, followed by a massive migration of free peasants from farm to city, and the creation of festering slums, to the increase in literacy, so conducive to the spread of the fresh and comparatively liberal concepts arising at home and abroad, product of many minds from the Lanthian Ryan Vissarion to the homegrown Shorevy-Nerien, and grouped roughly together under the title of the New Reasoning, to the weak, well-intentioned indecisiveness of the present king and the unpopularity of his queen, to the increasingly widespread suspicion regarding the decline of the old exalted magic, ancient basis of exalted privilege. All of these forces and more, acting in inexplicable interrelation, transformed the Vonerish population, creating an angry, turbulent audience, eager to embrace a neighbor Jumalle. Whiss time had come at last. The very first issue of his neighbor Jumalle's complaint caused a sensation by reason of its novelty. Seditious pamphlets, broadsides, tracts, and journals had flooded the city for years, but never before had there appeared a persona more fit to express the prevailing mood than that contentious, fearless, foul-mouthed Democrat, Neighbor J. A sizable segment of the populace had taken the neighbor to heart at once. Instinct and insight taught Whiss the double source of his creation's appeal, which lay rooted in fantasy and greed. The neighbor's untrammeled virulence, his freedom to defy and defame the great with apparent impunity, expressed the deepest longing of every wretched, angry peasant huddling in the slums of Shereen. In their minds and hearts, they identified themselves with Jumalle, vicariously assuming the mantle of his power, his audacity and independence. He spoke for them in their own crude language, yet imbued his words with a defiant eloquence that they themselves could never achieve. Moreover, his oft-repeated conviction that Crown and Exalteds owed the people material indemnification for the accumulated wrongs of centuries, indemnification to be paid in money, property, chattel, or even in blood, struck wildly responsive chords of righteous avarice in the hearts of a multitude. Cognizant of his own greatest strengths, Whiss had labored to augment them. Subsequent issues of Neighbor Jumalle's complaint waxed in scurrility, obscenity, and verbal violence, and the journal's popularity had soared. The editor acquired a coterie of worshipful followers, and the People's Reparation Party was born, its burgeoning strength finally reflected in this evening's first, more or less, public meeting. Neighbor J was at last emerging into the light. Muted lantern light only, perhaps, but it was a start. But could he hold an audience? Would his eloquence move and rule them as it must, were he to succeed? It was all very well to rant in taverns and on street corners, where his verbal pyrotechnics were viewed as so much free entertainment. But before a real audience, favorably disposed, to be sure, but at the same time demanding, critical, temperamental, what reception might he expect? Should he inadvertently offend them, confuse, or simply bore them, they might shout him from the rostrum. One miscalculated word at so critical a juncture, and he stood to lose all that he had fought so hard for, all that was rightfully his due: recognition, fame, influence, consequence, significance, all. Impossible now for Whiss, confidence undermined by years of dreary anonymity, to regain the assurance of his early provincial days. As time raced on and the night of the meeting drew near, the doubts and questions buzzed ceaselessly in his brain, fraying his nerves and haunting his dreams. At last, mere days before the event, he posted an urgent summons to his father, his first contact with Chorle Vallier since the night he had departed Noose. And Chorle, perennial prey to conscience in the matter of his unlovable and endlessly unfulfilled son, had answered the call, traveling all the way from Verve province to reach the 8th district of Shereen a mere 2 days prior to Neighbor J's address. With him, to serve as porter and bodyguard, had come his gigantic and inarticulate young nephew, Bierce Vallier, who now sat observing the scene in characteristic silence. It was Whiss's intention that Chorle should use his quasi-exalted magical power to cast a glamour, altering the perceptions of the spectators, rendering them super-susceptible to the influence of the speaker, suggestible and prone to adoration. Such intervention would surely guarantee success. Yet it was nonetheless galling, after years of effort, to find himself relying once more upon the arcane abilities of a father who had passed his talent on to a daughter, to younger sons, but never to the oldest son, who should by right have received it in full, never to the oldest son, whose genius and ambition could have made best use of it, never to Whiss. And now, to add insult to injury, at this last moment Chorle was unexpectedly recalcitrant. Chorle Vallier, who owed his deprived son every possible reparation, just as surely as Crown and Exalted owed reparation to the deprived commons, Chorle now demurred and hesitated, reluctant to lend his magical aid, stingy as he had always been. Nerves stretched to breaking, only just able to hold his frustration in check, Whiss paused in his pacing, drummed his fingers upon the desk, and remarked tautly, "I require your assistance less for myself than for those waiting out there to hear me, the miserable, the oppressed." On the other side of the partition the chant continued, Whiss, whiss, whiss. Will you fail us all? Do you owe nothing? The note of accusation was more pronounced than ever. Charles shifted unhappily in his seat. Do you owe nothing? Whiss repeated, perceiving his advantage. To me, or to those out there I seek to aid? Do you care for no one, for nothing save your studies? Do you take all and give nothing? With his usual sure instincts, he had managed to touch a nerve. Charles, who had neglected and all but ignored his family for the sake of magical self-development, was easily moved to guilt and correspondingly manipulable. The old man bent his troubled gaze to the floor. Come, look at me. Whiss's trained voice lashed without warning, and his father glanced up, startled. You've duties, obligations to others. Think of that, for once. You favor the cause I serve. Von Arge, liberty, and justice, do you not? Charles nodded uncertainly. Now you must prove it. Give me the help you led me to believe I might expect from you. I demand it. That's right, Uncle Charles. You near promised to help Whiss. The third man, the hulking Bierce, spoke up for the first time. Although he addressed his uncle, his little eyes remained fixed devotedly upon his cousin's face. Dazzled by the fame, dominant personality, and above all by the mesmeric fluency of neighbor Jay, captivated by the odd magnetism of the kinsman possessing all the qualities that he himself lacked, Bierce had fallen promptly and thoroughly under his cousin's spell. Within 48 hours of his arrival, his loyalty was fixed, his ambitions established. He desired nothing beyond Whiss's approval, Whiss's esteem, and perhaps a measure of Whiss's reflected glory. To these goals he was committed, now and forever. Son Whiss, nephew Bierce, Charles returned in earnest innocence. I'm not sure you've considered the implications of this thing you're asking of me. To influence the perceptions of others by artificial means is an act that raises many ethical issues. To be sure, the exalted have used their powers of illusion selfishly and irresponsibly throughout the ages. For this, they surely deserve censure. But if those among us who possess their ability without their privilege repeat their offenses, then surely we are no better than, You near promised to help Whiss, Bierce repeated, as if he simply did not hear the other's words. Now you have to. Setting his wheels and gears aside, he rose and took a few steps around the desk to pause before his uncle. Staring down from his great height, he added, Whiss needs you. Charles Valeur gazed up into the expressionless face looming so far above him. His eyes traveled down his nephew's massive frame to the big hands hanging loosely clasped and very near him. His eyes widened a little away for future reference, but he appeared to notice nothing. His voice was gently grave, manner earnest, and ingenuous as Charles' own, as he observed, It is for the best possible cause. Father, why have you spent a lifetime perfecting your magical art, if not to use it in this great endeavor, the liberation of your own kind? As a man of the people owning the magical ability of an exalted, your position is unusual and your potential value almost incalculable. It lies within your power to ensure the triumph of right and justice. Will you not use that power? You will be known to history as a hero and patriot. Come, Father, will you not join us in the fight? He had offered the old man a face-saving means of acquiescence, and Charles seized upon it at once. Very well, he conceded. I will do my best. Only his wrinkled oatmeal pallor and the rigid tension of his clasped hands revealed his lingering reluctance. Bierce returned to his wheels and gears. Charles expelled his breath in a faint sigh, while Whiss permitted himself a smile of gratified idealism. Outside the office, the chant grew louder. Whiss, whiss, whiss. Let's go then. Fear seemed all at once to have drained from Chorl into Whiss, who now stood white, tense, and crazily resolved. For one moment, time slipped, and Chorl Valeur was back 30 years in the past, looking down at a puny, intense, and unappealing boy determined to excel, and that recollection made it easy. Speaking with a conviction that almost made his compliance seem voluntary, Chorl told his son, "You're wrong in thinking you require magical aid. Your own natural eloquence might carry you anywhere. Since you won't trust in that, I'll do what I can, and you may be certain your audience will perceive you as their hope and savior." Whiss threw him a glance, half skeptical, half astonished. Then, tight-lipped and glass-eyed, he squared his shoulders and abruptly exited the office through a gap in the partitions. The audience was chanting his name. As he appeared, the chant swelled to a roar. A few swift strides took him to the makeshift podium. He mounted and turned to confront a sea of faces. For a moment, they merged and blurred before his eyes. He did not pause to look behind him, and thus he did not see his father, head bowed and arms folded, murmuring studiously to himself. Whiss hesitated a moment, then threw wide his arms in an expansive gesture of greeting and acknowledgement. The roar of the crowd built to a crescendo, and then, as he stood there perfectly motionless, died to an expectant hush. When the room was silent, Whiss allowed his arms to sink to his sides and spoke at last, in a conversational, almost casual tone, inconsistent with the flamboyance of his initial gesture, yet suitable in style to the tastes of neighbor Jumalle's admirers. "So, this is good. I see there are still men and women among us not to be scared off by the blood-drinking demons." "What demons? You don't really need to ask that, do you? You already know, better than anyone should have to know. We all know about the demon want, the demon that tells us that hunger and cold are all that we can expect, all that we deserve. We know about the demon injustice, who tells us that other men are better than we are, that other men's children are better than our children. When the lackeys of the exalted kick us around like dogs and we tell ourselves it's the way of the world and we've just got to swallow it, well, that's when we shake hands with the demon injustice, isn't it? And we all know him. And then, of course, there's the demon fear. He's one of our closest comrades, the one we can rely on. Why, all of us are close to him as lovers. When we daren't speak what we think, when we don't care to show our faces in a public place for thought of the trouble it means, well, that's when we're snug between the sheets with fear, isn't it? Like it there in bed with fear, my friends? Having a good time there? Like getting buggered floor to rafters and back again every day of your lives? No? Want to pay him back as good as he gives? I see. So that's why you came here tonight." A gale of laughter greeted this sally, and Whiss's confidence returned. He found he could sense the mood of the crowd. Instinctively, he knew its fears, its hungers, hostilities, and needs, and sensing these things, he recognized his own power. He could influence these people. He could read their minds and hearts. Their emotions lay open and accessible, like the keys of a harpsichord upon which he might play music of his own composition. In that moment, his doubts vanished. He had nothing to fear from his listeners. He could do with them as he pleased. They were still laughing. He had intended to wait until the laughter subsided of its own accord, but now he knew he did not need to wait, for he was master here. He lifted his hand, wordlessly enjoining silence, and sure enough, the noise died away. "You can get even with the demons, my friends," Whiss resumed. "You can have satisfaction for everything they've ever done to you and yours. And how do you pay them back? I'll tell you how. You do it by making them pay you back. Do you hear that? You make them pay you back, with interest." Affirmative cries from the audience. "That's right. But how do you get payments out of a demon?" Whiss inquired. How do you put the squeeze on want or injustice? How do you corner our old comrade, fear? There's only one way I can think of, and I've got a hunch that everyone in this room already knows what it is. A pregnant pause to advertise the significance of what was to follow. You do it by proxy. You go after the demon's representatives here among us. You take what's due from those of you who do the demon's work, from the demon's human spawn, as it were. And you know who that is, don't you? Don't we all know who that is? Angry voices answered him. The exalted! The king of fools and his whore queen! All the privileged and their little toadies! You're right, Whiss told them. You're dead right, my friends. The shouting rose in volume, and he allowed it to continue for a time, for the noise stirred their blood and their passions, which suited his purpose. And as he stood there waiting, something happened. It seemed to Whiss that the air rippled. Faces, bodies, lighted lanterns, everything about him wavered momentarily. His vision cleared, and all was as before. Almost. Whiss blinked. The scene before him was outwardly unchanged, yet he was seeing it as never before. Seeing beneath the surface, as if some outer layer had suddenly gone transparent. The spectator's collective emotions, which he had formerly sensed but not seen, were now visible, almost tangible, existing as a highly inflammable gas or haze of many colors, hanging above and about the audience, swirling and spreading throughout the room. Its motion was chaotic and unpredictable, but not ungovernable. Whiss knew by sure instinct that his words possessed power to shape that roiling mist, to rule its currents, its colors, and density. He knew without instruction that he desired a uniform hue, to mold those disparate spectators into a single, mighty, mindless entity, subject to his will. He knew, too, that he required intense pressure to create the explosive atmosphere into which he might fling the lighted torch of his rhetoric. All these things were clear to him in an instant, and as he glanced aside to see his spent father leaning against a partition, invisible to the audience, he understood the cause. Chorl had completed his magical commission. Whiss looked out over the audience, blanketed in thick clouds of emotion. Through the haze he could see the faces, and through the faces the things beyond, the fears and needs. He perceived the frustration, the angry hunger, the longing for direction, for unequivocal and comprehensible answers. And he felt the great tide of their affection, their admiration and faith in him, bathing him in delicious warmth. No matter that this adoration was artificial in origin, born of his father's machinations. For the moment, it was real, and all that he had ever dreamed of, all that he knew he deserved, come to him after decades of striving. His heart contracted and his eyes stung with tears. He paused a moment, partly to collect himself, partly to luxuriate in unaccustomed sensations of total acceptance, love, and dominance. He was careful not to pause too long. The mist swirled about the audience in wildly varying patterns and colors, raw medium of his art. His father's magic had primed the canvas, but his was the hand of the master. We all know our enemies, Whiss resumed, and even to his own ears, his voice had acquired new power and resonance. We know what we have to deal with. But maybe some of you out there don't like the idea of rocking the boat. Maybe you think it's more trouble than it's worth. Maybe you think it's hopeless, or maybe you even think it's wrong. If so, it's a good thing you've come here tonight, because you're the ones I want to talk to. If you're one of us, and you don't believe in your own right to collect what the privileged owe you, then there are some facts you're forgetting. You're forgetting the suffering of your kin, your fathers, and your fathers' fathers. You're forgetting the way they've used you up, then tossed what's left onto the dung heap. You're forgetting the misery and degradation, the hunger and cold, the kicks and blows. You're forgetting everything they've ever done to you. No matter, Tonight I'm here to remind you. He spoke on. Whiss's sense of timing was excellent. His account of the peasant's suffering at the hands of the exalted was poignant, vivid, and harrowing, but it was not protracted. Brief and intense was most effective, for the audience's attention span was limited. He chose a couple of individual examples, presenting them concisely. He told of Pakistan, serf of Gironde, sentenced to death for poaching. Blinded, deprived of his right hand, and turned out of his village to wander the barren hills of the dead of winter. No one had dared to aid the condemned man, yet it had taken Pakistan a full 3 weeks to die. He told of Widow Domer, a woman of Varves, who, crippled with illness, unable to work, and faced with the prospect of slow starvation, had murdered her 3 young children in order to spare them the endless miseries of a peasant's existence. His voice cracked and shook as he spoke of these things. His eyes blazed with grief and rage that were, in the heat of that moment, perfectly genuine. The audience listened, transfixed. Long before he had finished, scores of faces were wet with tears, but no one uttered the smallest sound for fear of missing a word of Whiss Valleur's address. Whiss spoke on, and as he spoke, he watched the mists change, the varied currents of color blending and melding into a consistent whole, until every anomaly had vanished, every scrap of individuality was lost. And a single great uniform cloud floated before him, its color deep and somber. He exerted his will, using his voice, his body, his face and eyes, and the currents surging through the cloud danced and swirled at his mental command. The rapt faces of the listeners reflected identically obedient responses. It was easy, almost absurdly easy. Now it was time for the crucial change, time for the spate of words that would fan their long, smoldering rage, charging the funereal mists with the brilliance of wildfire. Whiss took a deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice had altered. It was negligent, even contemptuous. You feel sorry for Pakistan, maimed, starved, and frozen to death for the crime of seeking to feed his family? You pity the widow Domer, driven to desperation first to infanticide, then to suicide? I see by your faces and by your tears that you do. Well, he shrugged, don't bother. Save your pity. Those 2 aren't worth it. They're dirt. They're scum. They're nothing. And so is everyone here in this room tonight. You're all nothing. You're not worth a thimbleful of rat's piss. He paused again. They were gaping at him, their sensations of amazement and bewildered incredulity perfectly plain to the speaker. He let them wonder an instant, then resumed. Or so the tyrants would have you believe. The bloodsuckers, the slave drivers and butchers, the demon's spawn. They all want you to think you're nothing, that you don't matter. It suits them just fine that you should think so. The question is, have they made you believe it? Have you all swallowed their shit for lack of a better diet? Let's just see. How many here think of yourselves as garbage? If you're garbage, raise your hand. Let's all see it. No reason to be ashamed, since garbage has no pride. Come on, let's see your paws in the air. He waited. No hands rose. What, none of you? Not a one? Looks like you don't really believe you're garbage. Looks like you don't relish the taste of exalted shit. Fancy that. Whiss flashed a brief sardonic smile, which seemed to the audience imbued with special charm. Maybe some of you even go so far as to think of yourselves as human beings. Is that what you think, my friends? That you're human beings, good as other men and women, and a lot better than plenty I could name? And if that's what you are, then don't you have the natural right to live as human beings? If you disagree, feel free to speak up. There were no disagreements. "Do you all understand what I mean when I speak of your right to live as human beings?" Whiss inquired. "I'm talking about your rights to freedom, equality, and fair dealing. I'm also talking about your right to work for yourselves, to build decent homes for your families, to warm and feed and clothe your folk against the cold, without some greedy crow of a tax collector coming around 3 times a year to strip you bare. Oh, maybe not completely bare. They generally leave you just enough to sustain a stinking poor existence, because they're smarter than the simpleton who slaughters his last milk cow. But that isn't good enough. Because it isn't enough for human beings to just survive in misery and want. It might suffice for animals or for the worthless garbage they've tried to make you believe that you are, but it isn't good enough for men and women. Human beings need sound roofs above their heads. They need good fires upon the hearth, shoes in winter, milk for the children and wine for themselves, bread and soup, and maybe some meat once in a while. Human beings need these things. They deserve them. And in any kind of a just society, we'd all have as much. Do you smile at that, the idea of a just society? Does it strike you as some fool's sky castle? Well, it isn't. If we've any brains, if we've any guts, if we all work together, it's something we can have." They sat enthralled as Whiss described his vision of a just society. It was a beautiful picture, fleshed out with images of healthy, well-fed, well-housed, and well-clothed citizens living and working together in harmony. Privilege would be abolished, serfs liberated, class divisions eliminated, and all men would be equal. Women would be free and respected, children cherished and educated. Property and goods would be fairly distributed to all. This material equality achieved, personal rivalry and resentment would die for lack of nourishment. Justice and contentment would rule Vonar, a land wherein all men were brothers and at peace. As he spoke, Whiss quite believed it himself. His conviction carried through to his listeners, who sat drinking in every word. Their enthusiasm was impossible to mistake, for as he spoke, Whiss could see the great dark cloud that enveloped the audience steadily brightening. The color was changing, leaden gloom giving way to lighter, livelier shades that reflected the mounting hope and enthusiasm of the listeners. That animation Whiss deliberately fostered. He wanted to rouse them, to set their hearts pounding and their blood racing. From there, it was but a short step to ardor of a different kind. Their faces were alive now, eyes shining and rapt, cheeks flushed with excitement. Beyond doubt, they were ready, and Whiss accordingly changed his tone. "This is our dream," he remarked quietly, so quietly that they had to strain to hear him, and complete silence fell over the room. "This is the world we want for ourselves and our children, and you can be sure we're going to get it. But don't think for one moment that it will be easy. It's going to be hard, my friends, worse than hard, because Vonar is full of big, fat, rich bloodsuckers, human leeches, the demons and their kind, who'll stop at nothing to keep us down. They like seeing us down there in the dirt beneath their feet. That's where we're the most used to them, and that's where they think we belong. And they're clever. They're going to think of 1,000 different tricks to keep us where we are. Want to know what to expect? Well, they'll start by trying to ignore us, to show how little we matter. But they'll soon find they can't make a whirlwind go away by pretending it isn't there. Next, they'll try words, a flood of words, all meant to convince the world that life is meant to be lived a certain way, with them always on top and us always in the muck. They'll scorn us, sneer down their noses, call us names, try to trick and confuse us with their double talk. But they'll find out soon enough that words don't work anymore. We're wise to their words. Next, they'll threaten us with their exalted magic, which might worry some timid souls. But those of us with our eyes open can see what's clear before our faces. We can see that most of the exalted don't have any magic. If they ever had any at all, then it's gone now, or else so weak we don't need to worry about it. so they'll discover their old fairy tales aren't worth a pimp's fart. For the first time since he had begun talking, Whiss sensed a slight lessening of his control. Darkly confused whirls blemished the enveloping mists, and there was an uneasy shifting of weight, a stirring among the spectators. Evidently, their deep-rooted fear of exalted magic was not to be banished at a word, and it would be a mistake to press the issue here and now. Accordingly, he hurried on, and soon the audience was again unified and wholly his. And that's when the fun will really start. That's when the game will get rough. They've got their soldiers, their guards, their gendarmes, all armed and trained to kill. They've got their prisons, their shackles and whips, their axes, ropes, and gibbets. And you'd better know they'll use them. Stand up to the demons, demand your rights, and you're going to bleed. Some of you will die. Some of you will see your children murdered before your eyes, for they'll hunt us, their own countrymen, like animals. He enlarged at some length upon this topic. He spoke of exalted brutality, painting lurid pictures of the anguish, humiliation, and diverse outrages traditionally inflicted upon refractory peasants. Had he commenced with this topic, he might well have terrified his listeners, but now their blood was up, and his descriptions whipped their rage. The cloud that wrapped them stirred and shifted as its color flamed to a furious crimson. Whiss himself was by no means unaffected. A part of his mind remained quite detached, observing and directing the performance. At the same time, he genuinely experienced the emotion that he sought so deliberately to convey, as if aping the externals of anger intensified the actual feeling, which in turn enhanced the performance in a self-fueling cycle of reinforcement that set his pulses leaping and his heart hammering. His pale face suffused deeply. His great green eyes ignited, blazed, and bulged. His features contorted, nostrils flaring and lips writhing. And his trained voice, initially low and restrained, climbed swiftly in pitch and volume, swelling to shake the room with wrathful thunder. The spectators battened on Whiss's fervor. Presently they were screaming in sympathy, rising from their benches to wave clenched fists in the air. And Whiss, one part of his mind astonished and abashed by the storm he loosed, but on the whole sure and exultant, ruled them with his rhetoric, deftly shaped their desires, and channeled their passion with a word, a gesture. "We know what we have to deal with," Whiss reminded them at last. "We know the kind of vomit-swilling slime that's been keeping us down. They've been using us, despising us, pissing on us for years. And why shouldn't they if we've been willing to take it? Let's face it, we've made things easy for them. But now it's changing. The leeches, the bloodsuckers, the butches, they're not having it all their own way anymore. We're finally getting together. We, the people, the human beings, getting together to tell those pink-tailed, perfumed parasites that they can take their taxes, their feudal dues, their privileges, their finicking high-nosed airs, and shove them up their jeweled asses." The audience hooted and cheered in delight. "We're finished going hungry to pay their bills. That's over, and now it's time to settle the score." Wild applause. "We're going to take back everything they stole from us, and then some. We're going to take back our pride." Whiss jabbed the air with a clenched fist for emphasis. At the same time, he drove his heel down hard on the hollow podium, which banged sharply as a drum. Howls of fierce assent answered him. Hundreds of imitative fists rose to smite the air. Hundreds of synchronized heels slammed down on the floor with noise like the boom of cannon fire. "We're going to take back our self-respect, our dignity, our freedom, our honor." A florid gesture and a sharp stamp underscored each promise. The audience followed suit, stamping in concert, until the warehouse shook and the thunder rolled through the fetid lanes of the 8th District. Whiss held up one hand and the uproar subsided. "And we're going to take back the goods they've been robbing us of for all these years. The money, the land, the animals, the fine houses, carriages, silk clothes, and fancy food. Those things are ours by right. We paid for them with our sweat and our blood, and now the debt falls due. We, the people, demand satisfaction. Our honor demands freedom. Our reason demands justice, reward for the virtuous, retribution for tyrants, and our sufferings demand reparation. At long last, reparation. Reparation! The cry burst from hundreds of throats, savage and exultant. Reparation! What's that you say? Somehow Wiss's voice was easily audible above the din. I can't hear you. Reparation! I still can't hear you. Reparation! They roared in a voice of unimaginable power. The huge voice surged and beat against the walls. The enveloping mists were red and bright, violently agitated, shot through with jagged bolts of luminous force. It even seemed to Whiss that the scarlet air was furnace hot and crackling. Now I can hear you. Now I can hear you. And I want to keep hearing you. I want your voices to be heard in every corner of Vonar. I want all the world to hear your voices. Reparation! Up went the fist, down came the heel. Up went hundreds of fists, and down smashed a hot host of heels, their impact rocking the warehouse. A tremendous clamor arose, a confused outpouring of rage, fervor, and blind excitement, contagious as the plague. Amidst the pandemonium, even Whiss's magically enhanced voice was inaudible. Momentarily deprived of speech, he took the opportunity to study his screaming partisans in wonder. Their response brought a lump to his throat, but at the same time awakened his frustration. He had succeeded, almost to his own surprise, in whipping them to a frenzy, and now they would follow him anywhere, obey every command, gladly kill or die for him. His crazed disciples burned for action, while he himself burned to taste his new power. The time, however, was not ripe. Their numbers were as yet too few, and an ill-timed display would do more harm than good to his cause. But the immediate urge to command his followers, strong as the urge to fire a brand new gun, was almost overwhelming. Surely there was some task he could set them, some proof of devoted obedience he might demand of them now. Whiss's dilemma was resolved by the sharp sudden crack of musket fire within the warehouse itself. Following a few startled screams, the tumult subsided, and all present turned to the back of the room, where half a dozen of the city gendarmerie stood ranged about the entrance. One of them had fired across the audience. The others stood ready, muskets leveled. Dead silence fell over Whiss audience, and in that silence, the clear voice of the sergeant of gendarmes was easily heard by all. You citizens will disperse immediately. The sergeant looked to the podium. Master Whiss, isn't it? You are under arrest. The charge is sedition. You are coming with us. Down the central aisle that divided the ranks of benches marched the sergeant and his men. No one attempted to hinder their advance. The spectators were motionless, mute, and apparently stunned. Whiss stood frozen, watching them come for him. Out of the corner of his eye he could see his father, the old man gray-faced and all but overcome. Behind Chorl loomed Bierce, scowling and twisting his huge hands indecisively. No help there. He was on his own. Now, if ever, was the moment to test his power. He took a deep breath. When he answered the sergeant, his voice was strong and sure. Lackeys of the exalted, I defy you, and I spit upon the parasite tyrants that you serve. In the name of the people, I demand justice. I demand retribution upon all tyrants. Justice and reparation. He flung his fist skyward. He drove down his heel, and the podium banged, loud and sudden as the gendarme's own musket fire. As if the signal had broken some spell holding them motionless and silent, the spectators shook off their paralysis to answer with a deep, collective roar. Surging from their seats, yelling like madmen, they converged upon the astounded gendarmes. A couple of wild, ineffectual shots rang out, then the muskets were wrenched away from their owners, who swiftly disappeared from view, engulfed in a whirling, shrieking tide of humanity. As Whiss looked on in satisfaction, the upended muskets rose and fell repeatedly. Fists, boosts, and truncheons flailed. A few flying knife blades briefly caught the light. The victims' screams, if any, were lost in the hurricane howl of the mob. Within moments, the gendarmes were dead, battered, torn, and all but dismembered. Only one survived. The youngest and largest of them, a recruit no more than 18 or 19 years of age, managed by some miracle to stay on his feet. Luck or desperation carried him all the way to the door. Shaking himself free of several clinging assailants, he exited the warehouse at a run. The jeering victors might have let him go, but some personal demon prompted Whiss to call out, "Stop him, my friends! Death to the enemies of the people!" They obeyed without hesitation or thought. Out into the alley they streamed, and there, by sickly lantern light, they glimpsed the fleeing figure of the young gendarme. Yelling, they gave chase. The fugitive made for the 8th District station. Through the winding streets he sprinted, reaching the station some 60 seconds ahead of his pursuers. Entering, he slammed the massive door behind him, dropped the great bar into place, then turned to confront a dozen or so of his amazed comrades. Breathlessly succinct, he gave warning. Moments later, Whiss minions arrived to find the stout old timber building standing closed like a fortress against them, and this quiet, impersonal resistance somehow fueled their crazy rage. For a time, they flung insults, refuse, and rocks, but the station was impervious to all. A pounding assault upon the iron-strapped oaken door proved equally ineffectual, but at least this attempt drew response. From the loopholes in the shutters of the second-floor windows popped gunfire, and 2 of the rioters fell. The survivors drew back, momentarily thwarted. At last, some canny soul thought of fire. A nearby stable yielded fairly damp straw, armloads of which were piled against the 4 walls of the station house and set alight by eager hands. Flames crackled, and eye-stinging, throat-closing clouds of smoke billowed. Presently, the wooden walls began to burn, and the mob screamed in triumph. Some of its members linked hands and danced in the street. Others embraced. Many stood chanting in fierce unison, fists rising to beat the smoke-filled air. "Reparation! Reparation! Reparation!" The flames leaped, and torrents of smoke gushed until the trapped gendarmes could stand no more. The station house was doomed, the atmosphere within already unbreathable. At last the door opened, and 13 coughing, choking defenders stumbled forth, their leader flourishing a white flag of surrender. Ignoring the banner, the mob fell upon the gendarmes, all of whom died swiftly, some beaten to death, others hanged from convenient lampposts. Thereafter, the victorious reparationists remained to cavort and sing around the blazing station house. In the matter of the fire, the 8th District was fortunate. The summer night was all but breathless, and the flames did not jump to neighboring buildings. Time wore on, and gradually the fierce exhilaration faded, giving way to confusion, to trepidation, to exhaustion, physical and emotional. Whiss inspiring presence was lacking, and each passing minute increased the imminence of the crowd queller's arrival. Despite all their leaders' reassurances, There was not one of the reparationists as yet willing to risk a confrontation with the queller of Shereen. One by one, they began to fade away down the alleys. The quiet trickle gradually increased to a flow. By the time the crowd queller and his followers reached the 8th District station house, they discovered a scene of bloody carnage, but no perpetrators. Whiss knew nothing of all this until some hours later. Immediately following the departure of his partisans, he was left in the warehouse with no companions other than 5 dead gendarmes and 2 live kinsmen. Chorle and Bierce emerged from the office. Bierce's face was flushed, his normally dull eyes shining with excitement and admiration. His bald right fist was rhythmically smacking his left palm as he observed, "That was something, Cousin Whiss. That was something." Whiss smiled indulgently, but his demanding eyes were fixed on his father's face. Charles said nothing. He appeared shocked, dazed, almost crushed. "Well?" Whiss challenged. "Well?" "You had better leave this place," Charles muttered at last, not looking at his son. "They will be hunting you now. You must go into hiding." "I shall." Smiling, Whiss surveyed the great room, atmosphere still fogged with crimson, lingering remnant of the crowd's fury, visible to himself and Chorle alone. He took a deep breath and straightened, squaring his shoulders. "But not, I think, for very long."
Thank you for listening to Orion's Bedtime Stories podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it and that you have a lovely, relaxing evening. Thank you, and